Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. I'm with David Frank. My name is Eric Kirk. We are uh, discussing the national political news of the day. There's all kinds of stuff to talk about. We had to narrow it down to a few topics, but we're going to start with the collapse of the border bill, a bill that Republicans should have loved. I mean, it gives the authority. It even mandates it if 4,000 people migrant encounters take place in a week. Homeland Security could decide to largely bar migrants from seeking asylum if they cross the border unlawfully. That became mandatory if it got over 5,000. Of course, we're told that they're like 10,000 a week. So it shouldn't have been too hard. There was other basically other changes that the pro-immigrant Democrats were opposing. They were going to vote against it. This could have been a big policy win for the Republicans, but apparently Donald Trump doesn't want any kind of a bill passed because he wants to use it as an issue for his reelection campaign. I think that the Republicans have made a big mistake here. It was killed in the Senate. They just couldn't get enough votes to send it on. Johnson had already said that that it was dead on arrival if it came to the House, but um, this is a big failure on the part of the Republicans. Combine that to the fact that they couldn't get enough votes to pass an impeachment articles against Mayorkas, the Department of the Interior guy, and that's a major failure. But because there's a few Republicans who are facing tough reelection that just did not want to be part of that insanity because there is no crime. Even incompetence is not a crime if you were to argue that he was being incompetent, and so they're hoping to revive that and bring it back. Of course, going back to the border bill, it was tied in with aid to Israel and Ukraine, which of course also failed with the border bill. The Senate Republicans are actually talking about introducing a standalone Ukraine aid bill. That's actually the part that is least popular with Republicans on the state. We'll see what happens after Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin is released. Apparently, was taken, and but you can get a hint of what he was saying because he was slamming the Western press for being so hard on Putin and so easy on Zelensky. So we got a lot to discuss here, but this was a bill to fund foreign aid in the two primary conflicts in the world right now. And this wasn't just sending money to the border. This would have been the first major immigration policy change in decades. Dave?
Yeah, this is actually being, or what, uh, let's say it this way. It was being promoted as the most conservative possible outcome. This was one of those um, negotiating situations where the highest priority for the White House, President Biden, and by extension his Democratic colleagues in both chambers, that they really wanted this aid package to get through for Ukraine. That was what we heard since before the holidays, and the Republican response for the last, say, 4 months or so has been, before we spend any more money on Ukraine, we really need to do something about the biggest crisis, the most urgent issue facing us, which is border security. So that's how this got bundled together. And when you listen to Minority Leader Senator Mitch McConnell speak about it, what he says is, we put Senator Langford from Oklahoma as the highest ranking member on the Homeland Security Committee in charge of the negotiations. And he spoke, it was a bipartisan negotiation. So we took all the best ideas from both parties, put them together, got to a point that we got Republicans and Democrats from both chambers to agree. And this is, McConnell said all this yesterday. But unfortunately, there was a demand from the House that countered 180 degrees from what their original demand was to link these things together. Their new demand as of this weekend, I think it was Sunday night, in response to former President Donald Trump, that they were not going to move anything forward at all.
Mhm.
So we can talk more about it, but lots of folks came out in favor of why it would accomplish what everybody's been talking about as the highest priority of Republicans. It would have addressed every issue that they wanted addressed. We can get into details again, like I said, but to me, this illustrates that President Trump has such a strong hold over not just the national GOP, Republican Party, but also Congress. Both chambers, the Speaker and the Minority Leader, capitulated 100%, and basically both went against commitments that they've made to secure the border.
And this is a problem because they have quite possibly handed the border issue to the Democrats. I mean, to Biden. He's going to say, "Hey, we had a bill that would have addressed this, but Congress is or the House and the Senate Republicans are refusing to act." Of note, there were 3 Republicans who voted for it, but there were also 3 Democrats who voted against it. Bernie Sanders, Melendez, and I believe our own senator here all voted against it because they think that that the new policy would have been too draconian. Plus Bernie Sanders doesn't want to send aid to Israel until they completely change their strategies for war. Bernie Sanders had previously been criticized by progressives for saying that he didn't think a permanent ceasefire was possible with Hamas, but he definitely, upon looking at the body count, didn't want to vote for it. So the Democrats don't have a full unity, so it couldn't pass. And I think a big loser in this is Mitch McConnell. He couldn't deliver it. This was supposed to be his big thing. He could have accomplished a major policy deal, but this kind of leads to the Democratic talking point, whether or not it's accurate, that it's not about policy for Republicans right now. It's about winning, and specifically Trump winning, even if it means that they lose the House.
So I agree with everything you just said, that it becomes an issue where you could say, if you are a Democrat running in either chamber, or even, if Biden could articulate this effectively, he might be able to say, I stepped up and I did what I needed to do. I got everybody in alignment. We budgeted more for an increase to review these people and manage the border than their current budget. The increase is bigger than the entire enforcement budget. So it's a massive investment. $20 billion for border security. I know we throw around these numbers, but increasing border security agents and asylum officers, expanding detention beds, increasing drug screenings, ending catch and release, raising the qualification for asylum requests. That's a big one that Democrats think goes against democratic values, is rewriting the asylum law that was written in response to the Holocaust, basically, when the United States turned away Jewish migrants coming here to escape near certain death. The United States said not interested. So our asylum laws are based on basically, a response to that callousness that we've had in the past. But more importantly, I think for everybody involved, there's a massive, people estimate 7 to 10 year backlog on asylum processing. So a huge commitment to rapid asylum processing, upon entry. To give a little bit more empowerment to say, you don't meet the threshold. For example, you didn't come through a regular normalized channel. You came through an illegal channel. You're not going to be eligible for asylum if you just walk through the desert. You have to come in, present your evidence, make your case, and then that would be expedited, and the backlog would be expedited. I've talked to Republicans from various states across the country for years on this issue. That's the number one thing that people, armchair kind of policy amateurs, they say, why don't we just follow the law? And what I always say is we don't have the resources dedicated. We don't have sufficient courts. We don't have sufficient processing facilities. So that's it's like the original sin. And then finally, one last thing about this bill was that they were going to say, look, it's truly emergency if it reaches this threshold, X threshold, which was $4,000, excuse me, 4,000 people per day over any given week, 5,000 people per day, mandatory shutdown, complete shutdown. So they would say, like, once we have a surge, then we're actually going to fully shut it down. And if it's 6,500 people in one day, we're going to fully shut it down. Well, if we are currently experiencing 10,000 people a day for the last couple of years, or you and I have gone into the exact numbers before, it would be shut. If this was past, the border would be shut. So to be honest, it just shows the emptiness of the commitment to deliberation on addressing what people claim to be such a crisis. And I'll say one last thing here. I think the elephant in the room is that the whole bill is 118 billion, 60 billion of it for Ukraine, 14 billion of it for Israel, 10 billion of it for humanitarian aid in Gaza and in Ukraine for refugees fleeing Russian aggression, and 5 billion for partners in the Indo-Pacific. So that means, basically protecting Taiwan and other allies from Chinese aggression. So it's a massive supplemental foreign aid bill. Disguised as a border bill. So what is actually going to end up happening is, because the Republicans broke the commitment to keep these things linked that they made, now these things are going to be presented independently of each other, and they're going to have to be weighed on the merits. And I think that's probably, as a country, we're probably a little bit better off that, hey, let's look at each thing independently and let's hold people to account. Vote on Israel, vote on border, vote on Ukraine, and then you can hold your leaders accountable based on their positions on specific foreign policy goals and border security goals.
No, I mean, there were a lot of there were other things that they really the Republicans could have gotten out of this that really they've been pushing for years. It would have introduced a process in which immigration services could decide an asylum claim without having to go through the immigration court system, basically denying immigrants what we consider to be due process rights.
Exactly.
But it also, the Democrats got a few things from it. Codifying, for instance, would have codified that if the emergency authority was triggered, they would have to process at least 1,400 asylum applications at the ports of entry. That's to encourage people to go through there rather than across the Rio Grande. But it also expedited the asylum processing timeline from years to 6 months. That would have, of course, required money, but that would also clear things up. I mean, there's a lot of things that there were only a few concessions that the Democrats got out of this. This could have been something that Republican representatives and senators could have gone home bragging about, but they don't have it because apparently, unless there's some other reason, but the analysts are saying it's because Trump needs this as a wedge issue for his campaign. It's the one thing they've got. We'll talk about the economy later in the show, but one of the analysis is that with the economy getting stronger, more people are thinking now about the border. That is the second most urgent one if you're not a young person, in which case it's abortion. But it's just it's mind-boggling that they basically sacrificed getting what they've wanted for years with very little concessions. And it's almost like the Democrats knew this was going to happen. Now they get credit for trying, and can hit the Republicans over the heads with it. And the problem is that I think it's a miscalculation because Biden's going to hit Trump over the head over and over again.
Yes, and so it will be part of it is part of the election cycle, particularly at the presidential level, like you said. But just to put a fine point on it, that for folks who maybe protect themselves from the news. People are coming out and saying overtly that this is because of political concerns. The climate has changed. The presidential candidate that we support has changed the climate. But more than just an unwillingness to even take up the bill in the House, Speaker Johnson has said basically like that's his position was, well, the president could just do it. The president doesn't need this bill. But Senator Langford said, hey, if that were true, and he said this on the floor of the Senate, the floor of the Senate. He said, if that were true, the border security bill that you guys passed last year, HR 2, you trumpeted it as addressing an urgent priority last year. If you didn't need Congress to act to make this happen, why did you make it such an urgent priority? And why did you point at it as a critical legislative accomplishment and blame the Senate for not paying attention to it? You wouldn't have done that, which means that you're a hypocrite. And more than a hypocrite, you are somebody who is taking marching orders from the former president. And he didn't say that last piece as explicitly, but what he did say is that he was contacted by a colleague that threatened him and said, if you move forward with this bill, we will come at you with everything. And he said that in the floor of the Senate. So it's not all the quiet part is out loud now.
I mean, and the question is what do Republicans do for this? This is a fiasco for them, as well as the failure to be able to move forward with their impeachment, because several Republicans don't want to be on board with that. We will be discussing this again.
Senator Reverdy Johnson worried that the final version of Section 3 did not include the office of the presidency. He stated this amendment does not go far enough because past rebels may be elected president or vice president of the United States. So, he asked, why did you omit to exclude them? I do not understand them to be excluded from the privilege of holding the two highest offices in the gift of the nation. Senator Lott Morrill fielded this objection. He replied, let me call the senator's attention to the words, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States. This answer satisfied Senator Johnson, who stated, perhaps I am wrong as to the exclusion from the presidency. No doubt, I am.
Next topic. Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, has had the appellate court panel in the D.C. district unanimously reject his immunity claim, saying that he no longer enjoys immunity as of the presidency. He is now merely a citizen, and they rejected it. And it was a big question as whether or not Trump and his attorneys actually expected that argument to win, but it's been used primarily to delay the case. But the panel also, including one Bush-appointed Republican, or Republican appointee, we don't know what the actual party affiliation is was that also you're not going to be able to use this to slow it down very much. We are cutting down the time in which you have to respond, which they do have the discretion to do that. And if you want to appeal this and go for certiorari with the Supreme Court, you're going to have to do this, I think, by February 12th or something like that. And pretty quickly. They can't, he's not going to be allowed to drag it out. That might be the real loss there, because like I said, it's real questionable as to whether or not anybody thinks that, once you've been president, you're immune from criminal prosecution for the rest of your life. There's just nobody who believes that. It's a holdover from Hobbes' Leviathan, and not even that, because that's supposed to be the supreme in power forever. So it's just, but he's entitled to due process. And I'll be curious. I mean, Trump can try to request that the appeal, that the appellate court, the appellate court area rehear it with a full panel, and but the likelihood of that happening based on the ruling is that there probably is no intention. They're going to have to go straight to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court has to decide whether they're even going to hear this thing. And they are not hearing everything Trump brings to them. They may be a little tired of that. So this is a big, a kind of a loss. He has been able to drag it out. Probably the trial, a couple of the trials aren't going to happen when they were planned, but because Jack Smith was unable to get it expedited to the Supreme Court back in December as he had hoped. But there's only so much limits, and I question whether the strategy is going to help Trump. I mean, it's obviously he's already got the nomination pretty well secured now that Nikki Haley in the Nevada primary, which wasn't going to get her any delegates anyway, but lost to the none of above choice. So, which is basically the Trump choice, but still, so Haley is probably done. We'll see what we'll see what happens in the next couple of primaries. But so he's got the nomination secured. Delaying this into the general election run after the conventions or near or after the conventions, probably not in his best interests politically. So I'm not sure exactly, what Trump and his attorneys are thinking. He's firing attorneys again. He fired, I'm forgetting her name now, who was handling the trial, the parking garage attorney who was handling the trial that he just got nailed for $83 million in, so trying to hire others. But what is his strategy at this point? It doesn't look like the courts are willing to push the trials back to when he could potentially be president.
Thank you for that setup. I think everything you said is spot on. I think the big takeaway from the decision is that it's pretty ironclad in language, basically saying, hey, you raised the issue that presidents must be able to get away with everything forever because otherwise presidents are going to be persecuted in the courts once they leave office. But they basically said, well, considering that this is the first time it's ever happened, probably not so much. And secondly, there is just no justification for neutralizing the most fundamental, this is a quote, the most fundamental check on executive power, the recognition and implementation of election results. We just cannot, this is a quote, we cannot accept that the office of presidency places its former occupants above law for all time thereafter. So it's basically ironclad. And then from my perspective, the question is, once they have written, across 57 pages that there is no such thing as absolute immunity for what he has being, accused of doing, the idea is, well, what next? Like you said. So what they said, if Trump doesn't appeal at all, or his lawyers, by February 12th, then it just goes back to the district court as if, nope, no immunity, peace. But we, everybody, all the commentators, you and I, people who have talked about this with have said that Trump would love to play this thing out past the election, past Inauguration Day, and then that way he could just, exonerate himself with them, so he could give himself that pass, that free pass, basically, get out of jail free. So there's an organization called Just Security, and they did this pretty cool analysis. I saw somebody comment on it earlier, and then so I just had to look at the chart myself, and I kind of boiled it down because nobody wants to read all the legalese and technicalities, but the article is called "How Long Will Trump's Immunity Appeal Take?" So Supreme Court, that's where it's going next. And Trump's team's already signaled that based on what the appellate court said, which is what you said earlier. They could deny him a hearing altogether, which would then just go back to after February 12th. Then the court, then he's no longer in question, and then the district court would pick it up. But no one thinks that's going to happen. So then they could either fast track it by using the existing briefs. They could say, because Justice Roberts, based on geography of the U.S. District Court for District of Columbia, appellate court for the District of Columbia, So Justice Roberts could say, we've all heard enough. We'll just fast track this thing. If they did that, there would be, a trial probably back in district court by June 1st, and that decision could happen as soon as September 1st. But that seems really unlikely. Instead, the court is going to say this is a really important. It's likely to say this is an extremely important issue. Oral arguments are going to start by March, early or late March. Supreme Court would have until mid to late April to decide, and then the trial court would end up starting up again by early or late July. And then that estimated based on how long trials take, the district court decision would be mid to late October. So their best guess, as a panel of experts got together and said, all things being equal, it's likely that late October, the week before the election, will have, if everything stays on timeline and there's not a major interruption in the court schedules across two different courts, we could get a decision. But of course, then there'd be appeals. So it's not like he would suddenly get be placed in house arrest or anything.
No.
It's just that we would have something before the election we are likely, they say, to have something before the election to consider on election day, within a week or two of when they decide.
Now, will that even have a political effect? Will it, if he's convicted, will anybody change their minds, whether they like him or don't? I mean, certainly the criminal cases, the civil cases that he has now lost on two occasions and has been hit doesn't seem to faze the Republican supporters. Maybe some of the Republicans, but not many of them. And so, he's unlikely to be in jail before the presidency, but it will be real interesting to see what happens if, I believe there's a rule that the president can't be prosecuted while he's president. Can he do jail time when he's president? Once he's been prosecuted, if there's been a guilty verdict? I don't think the Constitution is really specific on that. And so we could be entering brand new territory. And of course, as we know, he's facing several criminal charges, and including one state set of charges. And we're just on completely new territory here. But it's very likely that at least one of those cases is going to happen this year. The political consequences when you've got millions of people who believe the government is just owned by the deep state and is when you don't have faith in the system. I talk to MAGA people all the time who don't really understand how a jury verdict works. They say, "Well, what's your evidence that Carol was raped or sexually assaulted?" And I said, "Well, her testimony." "Well, that's not evidence." It's like, no, yes, testimony is evidence. In fact, it accounts for probably about 90% of the evidence in criminal and civil cases across the board. It's rare that you have physical evidence, or except in cases of intellectual property and business stuff where you've got some documentary evidence. But in a criminal case, it's mostly testimony, and a jury has to decide based upon their evaluation of the mannerisms and how they act in court as to which one is more likely than not telling the truth, or whether or not one is telling the truth to convince beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, they found that Ms. Carroll was telling the truth. This wasn't by propensity of the evidence, which is more likely than not. That two juries have now agreed with them, and they were unanimous. But I hear people saying, "Well, yeah, those were hand-picked jurors." It's like, no, you had two sides picking the jurors, right? You both sides have the rights to do this. Well, it's New York City, and the pool is all liberal. So, well, it is, but it's not entirely liberal. And it's just it goes back and forth. I don't think that. It may have a political impact on, middle of the road voters, the 10% or whatever, who are not really partisan. But I'm feeling like they're probably already going to vote against him anyway. The only issue is whether or not the votes get suppressed. And so that's a whole other issue. So how this is going to play out, but this was not the ruling that Trump was looking for. Trump wanted to basically guarantee that the trials wouldn't even happen till next year.
Right. And I think that based on what I outlined earlier, experts seem to think that there will be a trial before the election. As of now, that's where it stands. And I wanted to just pick up on what you had said about the folks that are still persuadable. All things being equal, I agree that we have, like a trench warfare kind of distinction between people that are going to support him no matter what and the people that are going to not support him no matter what. Like that's, but all things aren't equal. And so we have seen a variety of polling organizations find that there are folks, I think it's about 50% across both parties and independents. So it's not likely Republican voters, it's not likely Democratic voters, it's all likely voters. About half the people have said that if he is convicted, found guilty of a felony, that they would reevaluate their support.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big enough chink in the armor. Chink in the armor? I forgot. It's a big enough. There you go. Yeah.
Or kink in the hose.
There you go. It would be more than a marginal difference. And so what does that mean? Well, when we look at the national polls, what we see is that, maybe it was basically even money for a long time based on the margin of error, but that there's a trending popularity or bias more towards Trump now nationally, in part, I think, just because there's a lot of negativity related to the United States' Biden's decision to support Israel unconditionally, losing support among young folks, losing support among people of color, variety of groups that he's just losing some support based on just kind of not walking the walk, not really being the true alpha that we need in time of crisis. So that's understandable. But that's the national polling. That's not how we decide the president. We decide the president using the Electoral College, state by state. And there are, approximately 42 states that nothing is going to change the outcome in. There's
Right.
Almost nothing, and meaning that there's about 8 states that are really in play. And when you look at those states, Trump is doing significantly better than nationally. So, he has a lead in effect. But then the $99 question, which, it's a contingent reality that we don't know what's going to happen, that even if 5%, that's 1 out of 20 people say, you know what, that guilty conviction is enough. That's not going to be enough in all of those states. Is it
Right.
going to be enough in 5 out of 8? We don't know. If it's 10%, is that going to be enough? So the jury's still out on this, obviously, but it's going to be a really long year for us to navigate as Trump gets more and more desperate.
Yeah, it is. And, the polls are starting to change a bit. In fact, in one QPAC poll, Biden was actually ahead by 5 points, probably an outlier, but it's hard to say. Because again, as we've discussed on the show a few times, there remains a lot of when you see the polls, it's like 39% for Trump and 35% for Biden, or 42% and 39%. That's a lot of people who are undecided, and we didn't really choose to. We'll get into a little bit of that discussion later, but it's this can decide it. So far, the civil cases, I don't know, maybe the civil cases have moved the polls. I don't know. We don't know we know the polls are moving. We're not exactly sure why. We'll talk a little bit about one possible factor in the next segment. This takes us to our third segment. More good economic news. I mean, to anybody who's reading the newspapers, the economic news has been good for, I don't know, probably a year now. Unemployment rate is down to 3.7%. It had been down to, I think, a historic 3.4 or something percent. This last jobs report, over 300,000 jobs. And of course, you'll see Town Hall and Forbes and other conservative media saying, well, those numbers aren't as good as they say they are. But, that's the type of thing you say when you're not happy with good news. The inflation looks like it's being controlled in certain things, not in insurance premiums. Unfortunately, that's jumped up. But most other stuff, the oil is dropping. Price of gas has been dropping and stayed relatively low, at least relative to a year and a half ago. So there's really good economic news. And the question is this going to help Biden out? Maybe it is already helping him out. As we've discussed, there's a little bit of movement in the polls. Not huge, though. There's some of the polls still have Trump ahead. It's probably about 2-1 with Trump having polls ahead, again, with those big undecided margins. And last time around, those undecided voters broke for Biden in the actual election. So, but at this point, does the economy matter? There was one analysis, I think, CNN, suggesting that, well, now that the economy is better, the border is going to be the issue, and no discussion as to abortion, which, is will it sustain? Will the anger and anxiety of young people, especially young women, sustain itself to impact the elections? Well, so far, they've played a role in every election since the Dobbs ruling. So we've got a lot to kind of discuss. But the question is the Raging Cajun, when he was running the successful campaign for Clinton against George Bush Sr., placed a note on his desk, on the wall next to his desk, that said, "It's the economy, stupid." Is that still true?
I do think that is like the bedrock under which people's feet need to be firm. So that there's been an analysis in the past. I'm not going to get super into it, but there's a materialist consideration and a post-materialist consideration, which basically means, like, if you are economically distressed, you don't have time to worry about things beyond the economy, basically, because you're struggling. So for most people, maybe the bottom 30 people hanging on, right? About 30%, they're just hanging on. But the question is the economy so bad that it becomes the bottom 50, the bottom 60, the bottom 70%? Once they're just hanging on, then you're done. And sometimes an indicator of that is the overall approval rating. Right now, Biden's got one of the worst, net overall disapproval ratings in the history of presidents. That's not a good sign. But I don't think that's directly related to the economy. I think there's other things at play there. Well, you proposed we talk about economy. So I looked, obviously I follow this anyway, but I looked for a commentator that was able to narrow this down to some bullet points that were easily digestible. And I found Jeff Stein in the Washington Post. And he said, that jobs report was plus 350,000 jobs last month. By any measure, that's great. I think the number is about 150, 180,000 18-year-olds enter the workforce each month. So in any given month, anything over 200,000 jobs is great. So beyond that, unemployment has been below 4% for the last 2 years in a row, which that hasn't happened since the 60s. And wage gains have outpaced inflation for over a year. That wasn't always the case. Since COVID, since the economic stress that our country, the world's been put under, the lockdowns, etc. But that has been improving, like you alluded to, for like a year. Also, number of workers working as a share of the labor force is strong, he said, which that's like, I think that's always about 65-ish% of people work. And you've got young people and you've got seniors. And so if as long as you have somewhere around that number, it's good. It's a strong indicator. Most importantly here for our purposes, inflation dropped from 9 to 3% over the last, say 18 months or so. And finally, the last positive that he mentioned was core inflation is down. So that means when you strip out things like that are volatile, like fuel costs, it's down to pre-COVID levels. So that's why when people say that the economy overall has improved, that's the kind of stuff they're talking about, these big macroeconomic indicators. I can pass off to you, but I can give you the flip side of the pain. Why would people feel pain if,
Sure. Well, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes here. I mean, Joe Bruselas, economist, basically his key takeaway: there ain't going to be no recession. That was his exact words. That's what the jobs report indicates. If you can get inflation under control and still maintain a positive net positive of jobs and income increases, there's not going to be a recession. Now, there was a caveat there because the Fed declined to commit to lowering interest rates, and that did cause a little bit of a flat line in the stock market, but it was temporary. It went back up again, and it prompted Donald Trump, who I think made a very uncharacteristic error in there. He's got really good political instincts. Whatever else you want to say about him, he's got a real feel for what is effective and things to say. But he was trying to say, well, the investors saw that I'm doing well in the polls, so that's why it's rallying on my part. Big mistake, because what he has now emphasized is that, hey, the economy's good. He wants to take credit for it 4 years after he's out of office, but nobody's going to believe that, right? So he's basically in contradiction to some of the right-wing media that want to see the doom and gloom, that really want. I mean, the party out of power really does want to see doom and gloom at this part. Maybe not on an existential level, but definitely politically speaking, they do not want to see these kind of numbers. Now you'll get into some of the downsides, but there are always downsides. I mean, Reagan created the biggest, one of the longest expansions up until that time, post-war, but he created a permanent underclass that was very large because he basically adopted Keynesian policies, military Keynesianism, as some left-wing economists would refer to it as. But in doing so, that is military spending is not very capital intensive, not very labor intensive. It's capital intensive, so you can stimulate the economy without having too much employment, and therefore without having a lot of inflation. So you got a bigger subset of poor people, but they don't vote anyway, so it's good for you, right? I mean, in this case, they definitely want. We know this because Mitch McConnell and the Republicans wanted to tank the economy. Under Obama, they tried for 8 years, literally, to do it. They denying him Keynesian relief. So
yeah,
Biden has a real advantage in this. It's not manifesting because, as you say, there are other reasons they're not really getting behind Biden. His age being one, and a few other things. But why don't we get into, there are some downsides to the economy. I mentioned the insurance industry, and there are some concerns. There are layoffs in the tech industry, which might be good for rent in the Bay Area. But other than that, it's not considered good news.
Yeah. So you and I have talked about sort of the macroeconomic issues, the sort of technical issues. I'm going to go back to Jeff Stein again, because I think he did a good job of boiling down some things people can really wrap their head around, which is Americans still have a hangover from inflation, right? Inflation was 6%, then it
Yeah.
was 9%, but now it's 3%. So this is called disinflation when inflation
Right.
slows down. But over a 3-year period, that's 18% inflation. And that's a lot. And in some sectors of the economy, it has a massive impact. That impact is things that create hardship. So hunger, poverty, the high cost of health insurance, the lack of people having access to health insurance as some of the COVID stimulus ends. The lack of a robust safety net has led to a 50% increase in childhood hunger. So the middle class is also not really feeling the effects the same way. That little magic, like third of the country that I talked about, that it really could be the marginal difference. They're not feeling the effects of the recovery because the conventional wisdom is the economy's gotten better. You mentioned the stock market. That's like the top 10, 20% of the people that benefit from that.
Except for people with retirement funds, they benefit too. But yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
The truth is that the top 10% of people own 80% of everything.
Yeah.
So in real gains, we all feel better when our 401ks go up. That is true, no doubt. So the biggest relative benefits, though, actually have been going to the lowest earning households, which is counterintuitive. It bucks the conventional wisdom, even though the top like 1% have gotten like a third of all the or more of all the gains to relatively speaking. For if you go from like marginally surviving to almost thriving, you feel a little bit better. So that's the middle class is getting hit really hard with inflation, and the number one reason people experience in self-reported data that they say they're experiencing economic distress on the daily is food prices.
Yes.
The White House put out a paper or a study result announcement that corporate profits continue to rise in the food sector, reaching a 20-year high. But the producer price index has fallen dramatically, so their costs have gone down tremendously. But this has not been reflected in consumer prices, and that's really so the pain that we feel is we blame on the political side, but the reality is it comes from sort of corporate profit taking only.
And the fact that for some reason supply and demand just doesn't seem to have a big impact on food. People are either they're willing to buy it or with higher prices, and maybe because they have to buy it. But restaurants are way up, and they're probably baked in. Restaurants don't tend to lower prices once they've reached a certain threshold because it creates the expectation. And you're looking at now deli sandwiches that cost $15 is the average probably. So it's just burgers are over $15, and people are angry about it, but they're also willing to pay it. That's the big contradiction of it.
So with food prices, yeah, I think your point is spot on that people they have to buy, they do buy, and they feel negative about it. So even though economically we can acknowledge that maybe the economy is doing a little bit better, politically we still hold the blame for the prices that we pay. But I think there's another big one we've talked about on this show before is housing affordability. We do have a housing crisis, but just raw numbers. This is me like just all things being equal. Again, the average home cost, the average in air quotes, has gone up by about 50% in just the last few years. Interest rates have nearly doubled in the last few years. That means that housing affordability for that average home has gone from about $1,700 per month a couple of years ago to $3,400 per month now. No household income is keeping up with that pace. So this not just locks people out of the housing market, meaning renters have to pay more, buyers have to pay more, but in reality, it also is perceived as locking people into their current home. You can't sell your house and buy something similar because it's going to cost you twice as much. So that is a sort of a unstated premise in this whole process. We all feel a little stuck. We all feel a little stressed. We can't. There's mobility just doesn't exist for most people. If you could pay cash for your house, like a hedge fund, sure, but no, that's not what most people do. And one other thing here in terms of negativity. If you listen to conservatives, you listen to Republicans, they're right about one thing in particular that I think we all need to pay attention to. We have reached historic levels of deficit spending each year in this country, not just a response to crisis like the economic collapse of 2008 or COVID in 2019, 2020. we still continue to spend, like right now, our deficit is estimated to be $1.4 trillion per year. In and of itself, that doesn't mean much. Overall, our total federal debt is like 34 trillion. Again, in and of itself, it doesn't mean much. But there's a macroeconomic uncertainty around our government being stuck in this mode where it borrows so much more than it spends. And the reality is that some of this low interest rate debt is becoming due. So even though we need to borrow about $1.5 trillion for this year, 2024, we're also rolling over $8 trillion in old debt. So we're going to borrow 10 trillion more this year at a much higher interest rate. Like we said, interest rates have doubled. That's going to accelerate the cost of debt, increase deficit spending every year going forward in our current projections. And finally, unfunded mandates and future liabilities for our citizens is about $212 trillion. So people have this uncertainty around Social Security, around Medicare, Medicaid, around the federal government buying, borrowing, spending. That uncertainty, that makes that bedrock feel more like quicksand sometimes to voters.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there is always a downside to it, but it's one thing again for the newspapers to all rally. The mantra, well, I don't want to say mantra, the slogan you hear from a lot of progressive working class voters is well, the fact that the economy is good for the top 1%, as you say, doesn't mean it's good for the rest of us. I mean, it's and it's always kind of been that way. I mean, I learned paying attention from the beginning in the 1980s that the stock market yawns whenever there's a good jobs report, whenever unemployment drops. That's not what they want, but that's to them as the economy. I think there's actually a disconnect between the stock market and the economy that is kind of growing. We will be discussing the economy, obviously, one way or another in the coming weeks.
Eeny, meeny, chili, beany, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
This brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
Well, picking up on one of the themes that we spoke about today, attention has turned to congressional GOP leadership, the minority in the Senate and the majority in the House, as both votes in both chambers failed to secure passage of longstanding conservative priorities. The supplemental spending bill in the Senate had far-reaching reforms to border security, and the impeachment of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas, where the majority leader could not hold the GOP caucus together in its meritless kabuki theatrics. This has stirred up a loss of confidence buzz around the GOP legislators. Now, Trump has a lock on the party because it's a presidential election year. That explains much of the timing of this infighting, but he doesn't get the blame for the chaos that he leaves in his wake. With that in mind, I predict Senator Mitch McConnell's lack of leadership and Speaker Mike Johnson's lack of competence will ultimately weaken both of their support and bring down both of these leaders.
Wow, that's a big prediction. All right, well, I'm going to stick with the horse race. In South Carolina this last weekend, Biden came away with 96-point-something% of the vote. Marianne Williamson and the guy from Minnesota not picking up very many votes in this. And that wouldn't, considering that they are very minor candidates, that wouldn't be considered a big deal. However, there was something in that race that Biden should and his supporters should take heart in, and that is that the black vote as the percentage of voters, there were fewer voters because there was no race, right? That last time Biden was in against Bernie Sanders, but the rate of the voters who participated, a percentage of them that were black, went up from 56% to over 70%. That it does suggest that he is re-engaging and possibly getting good support, possibly marginally enthusiastic support from black, and we will see this. And I do predict, as for the reasons we've discussed earlier in this show, and because the Republicans are messing up right and left right now, that Biden is going to move forward in the polls probably by the end of March or mid-March to the end of March, will be consistently ahead in the polls, and he will probably not look back. We'll find out if I'm true, if that happens. But until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.